Shabbat Shalom. This past November, 32 members of our community were able to travel in a very powerful journey to Atlanta and to Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham, Alabama as part of our civil rights journey. Just want to give a quick thank you to our co-chairs, to Dan and Wendy Dobris, to Mark Jacobs and Rabbi Melinda Mersak, to Brad Ortman and Dr. Melissa Myers, and to John and Darby Steiger, as well as to Rabbi Jacobs, who led the trip here from B'nai Yeshurun. Many of you I know are here this morning or watching via stream or Zoom, and it's really a pleasure to hear a number of participants speak and share their reflections, and I want to turn to Rabbi Jacobs to begin.
It was interesting timing for this trip. Many of us feel a rift between Jewish and Black communities in the wake of October 7th, like we're a far cry from that photo, iconic photo of Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel marching hand in hand, a photo that is actually much more complicated than many of us realize. But what I find so compelling is that this group, which really bonded throughout the trip, and really it's just wonderful to feel like we come out of it with so many new great friends, chose now of all times to double down on what binds Jewish and Black communities together, to double down on our shared commitment to justice, equality, and the urgent need to combat racism and Jew hatred in this country and beyond. One of our co-chairs, who it's my honor to introduce now, Brad Ortman, who will be speaking to us now, will say more on this, but we start the book of Exodus today. We just read it, the beginning of Exodus. On this Martin Luther King weekend, we return to our story of harsh bondage and servitude in Egypt. God calls out from the midst of the fire, "Let my people go." Words that penetrated the heart of King, Lewis, and Park's movement, that penetrated the heart of the Soviet Jewry movement, that still rings true in the wake of mass incarceration and the legacy of slavery today, and that still rings true as we pray with bated breath as news of the ceasefire develops, that our hostages return home now, all of them, and that Israel will know peace and security. It's my honor now to introduce Brad, who will speak to us with his reflections on the trip.
I'd like to first thank Rabbi Foster and Rabbi Jacobs for planning such an exceptional trip. As Rabbi Foster mentioned, we visited Atlanta, Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, and got to meet directly with some very brave individuals who took on leadership roles in the civil rights movement. It was especially poignant to make this trip now, as there are fewer and fewer leaders of the civil rights movement who are still alive today. I have long believed that Martin Luther King Day should be called Civil Rights Day. Don't get me wrong, I say this not in any way to diminish the legacy of MLK. His bravery and moral clarity deserve to be celebrated now and for generations to come. He was the key leader of the civil rights movement who took ideas of nonviolence and civil disobedience and put them into action at great personal risk, inspiring millions of Americans and catalyzing monumental change in American society. But the civil rights movement would not have been possible without the brave activism of the multitude of foot soldiers, people who were not afraid to stand up for their rights and for human dignity. It is important to remember the names and tell the stories of Rosa Parks, John Lewis, and Bayard Rustin, who you may not know, but he was the one who planned the March on Washington, because they all played critical roles. Let's also remember the allies. We as Jews can certainly be proud of our contributions to the civil rights movement. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Dr. King in Selma, Rabbi Arthur Lelyveld of Cleveland registering voters during the Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964 and getting beaten up by white supremacists for doing so. And of course, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney, who was he was African American, who were murdered by white supremacists that same summer in Mississippi for their activism. For every civil rights luminary whose name we remember, we must also recognize those who put their lives on the line in obscurity, because they played critical roles too. And through their more anonymous activism, they changed America to make it a more free and equitable society. Indeed, it is estimated that at least 70,000 people participated in sit-ins across the South to desegregate public accommodations. Think about that number for a moment, 70,000 people. They did this at great personal risk. They could be fired from their job. They could be beaten up or worse. Courage was the common thread that bound together the many events of the civil rights movement. We all know that black slaves drew inspiration from the Old Testament and the story of Exodus. Think of the old Negro spiritual, Go Down Moses, which has an honored role in our Seders. So too can we gain inspiration from our own tradition to be courageous and stand up for what is right. We need not look any further than this week's Torah portion, Shemot. We have Shifra and Puah, two Israelite women ordered by Pharaoh to kill Hebrew baby boys. They refused to do so, what you might say is an act of civil disobedience. Shifra and Puah's courage is to refuse an unjust command. We have Moses' mother sending Moses down the Nile in a basket in a desperate attempt to save his life. Moses' mother's courage is to act in a crafty way to protect her son. And Pharaoh's daughter rescuing the Hebrew baby Moses, the other, despite the fact that he is not Egyptian. Then she raises him as her own son. Pharaoh's daughter demonstrates courage by defying her father and recognizing the humanity in the Israelite slave. Then, of course, you have Moses smiting taskmasters who are beating Israelite slaves. Each of these actions are subversive in their own way, standing up for what is right and showing courage. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter of Lithuania sums up a view of courage that I find very inspiring. And though he wrote this in the 19th century, I think it really speaks to these times in this moment. Rabbi Salanter says, every person must hold on to and keep precious three qualities in order to live a life with courage. Not to despair, not to get angry, and not to expect to finish the task. No, courage must be cultivated daily. It must be cultivated for years before it's even given the chance to blossom. Courage comes from realizing that our role in the universe is unique, but limited. Yet it's this limitation that allows us to succeed beyond our wildest dreams. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad, for that inspirational call to courage as authentic insight and mandate from our tradition, and for sharing your reflections on our trip. We actually have an opportunity to hear.
As Rabbi Jacob said, we are grateful to Brad for a beautiful opening Devar Torah and reflection about the civil rights journey. We're now going to pause in our service and hear from 4 additional participants on the journey, and then we'll conclude together with Adon Olam and Kiddush, and then join for Kiddush. Our first speaker will be Allison proper.
Shabbat Shalom. Tzedek, tzedek, tzedek. Justice, justice, justice was a central theme that shaped our civil rights journey. Along the way, I had the opportunity to reflect on the horrors of slavery, the ongoing struggle for freedom even after emancipation, and the personal stories of heroism in the fight for civil rights. The most memorable part of my experience was hearing the powerful firsthand account of Miss Linda Blackman. Imagine being 7 years old when your mother suffers complications in childbirth that threaten her life. At the segregated Black hospital, there is no blood. Just down the street, at the white hospital, life-saving blood is available. But she can't have it due to Jim Crow laws. She must wait for the blood to be transported from a hospital an hour and a half away by bus. You pray and wait, pray and wait, pray and wait. But the blood doesn't arrive in time. Your mother dies 15 minutes before it finally reaches her. 15 minutes too late. After your mother's funeral, you overhear that she died because she was Black. This sparks a fire in you to fight for justice. In 1963, at 13, you attend a church event, expecting the dog King from a TV show, but instead find the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. His words inspired you to embrace nonviolence and fight for the right to vote. You and your friends joined countless marches to protest this discrimination. You recall how your father was denied registration after failing an absurd test, unable to count the seeds in a watermelon. Your parents can't march. They'd lose their jobs and risk your family being separated. So you march in their place, getting arrested 9 times before turning 15. Fueled by the death of your friend, caused by police brutality, you insist on marching from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights. But as you cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you're met with pepper spray, chased, and brutally assaulted. Years later, you watch footage of Bloody Sunday and learn how a state trooper beat you unconscious. A few weeks later, determined to make your suffering count, you beg your father to let you march with Dr. King and the 300 others from Selma to Montgomery. On March 21st, 1965, the day before your 15th birthday, you joined 3,000 people, Black and white, in solidarity. This time you cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge safely and complete the 5-day journey to Montgomery. There, you hear powerful speeches and performances in front of the Capitol. In that moment, you realize people nationwide care about you and your community. On August 6, 1965, your efforts are rewarded when Congress passes the Voting Rights Act, the very cause you marched for. Miss Linda Blackman, you are a brave hero who endured tremendous hardships. While there is so much work still to be done for civil rights today, your participation in peaceful protests made a significant impact. Today, you share your story to inspire others to fight for a more just and compassionate world. Your journey made me reflect on my own role in Tikkun Olam, how I can repair the world today. Thank you for inspiring me to share your story and commit to making a difference.
You've heard already from Allison and from Brad a little bit about our trip and our learning together and how meaningful it was for all of us. I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about how some of the specifics that were most impactful to me and the thoughts and hopefully the actions that will result. The importance of experiencing history in the places with the people who were there can't be overstated. For me, that had far more emotional impact than the museums and the monuments that we visited, despite the fact that each of those I would highly recommend that every one of you visit because they were so powerful by themselves. More specifically, as Allison talked about a little bit, we met with survivors of the moment. We visited places where history for better and more often for worse, actually happened. In many ways, it was akin to hearing from Holocaust survivors. The survivors that we spoke with certainly didn't have numbers on their arms, but they had scars on their souls, and as Allison described, they had scars on their bodies from brutal beatings as part of the civil rights marches and part of the civil rights activities. I don't make the comparison with the Holocaust lightly. Frankly, I think the analogy is fraught with all kinds of challenges. Those challenges are important. They're subjects for a long discussion, but on a different day. The scars on the people tell part of the story. The scars on the land and the building tell part of that story as well. Let me tell you a little bit about two people, one of whom Allison described beautifully, and two of the places. In Birmingham, we stood at the 16th Street Baptist Church, where three 14-year-old girls, 14 years old, and one 11-year-old girl were murdered when 17 sticks of dynamite were detonated. 17 detonated during a Children's Day service in a premeditated act of terrorism. Standing just yards from the church, we heard Calvin Woods. Bishop Woods is 91 years old. He stands every bit of 5'2", and he would fill this room. He told us of the struggle firsthand as the Holy Spirit in his words spoke through him. Bishop Woods was there for every minute of the civil rights struggle. He drove Martin Luther King to the airport on April 3rd, 1968, to the flight that took him to Memphis. It's been 56 years, but he still tears up when he tells the story. It's personal and it's still raw. In Selma, we walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where dozens of people were brutally beaten 5 months before I was born. They were beaten for being. Nonviolent marchers beaten simply because of who they were and what they looked like. The bridge is named for a rabid segregationist, a so-called Grand Dragon of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. That's Edmund Pettus. 2 years ago, almost 2.5 years ago, the Alabama legislature attempted to rename it the Edmund Pettus Foot Soldiers Bridge to honor those who were beaten. The bill specifically prohibited changing the lettering on the bridge, though. It would still say Edmund Pettus in large letters. Even so, the bill failed. Let's be clear. In 2022, a United States state legislature voted to continue honoring a Grand Dragon of the KKK. Simply being on the bridge was a moving experience, but for me, the most moving was hearing the testimony of Linda Blackman, as Allison described. Ms. Blackman was 14 years old the day she joined the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. For the crime of participating in an unauthorized demonstration, this young woman, for context, 14 years old, just past the age of bat mitzvah, was beaten into unconsciousness and needed 37 stitches in her head. 10 days later, Miss Linda joined the march to Montgomery under federal protection. Her testimony was indescribably moving, in part because it was so clear-eyed and so factual. To this day, she is an advocate for nonviolence. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. These are the words of Elie Wiesel and Knight. I thought of them many times throughout our trip. If I were there, would I have taken sides? I'm confident that I would not, that I would not have joined the oppressors, the segregationists, the violent mobs who were all too happy to beat children unconscious. I say that, though there were many Jews who were among the ardent segregationists. But would I have had the courage at the time to actively join those fighting for freedom, for others made B'Tselem Elohim? I don't know. I don't know what I would have done then. Excuse me. But I know what I need to do now and what I urge each of you to do. Take sides. Don't passively help the oppressor. Your activism need not be for continuing the fight for civil rights in the United States, though it certainly could be. It could be for the plight of the children near Kibbutz Re'im, or the plight of children in Gaza, or the children in Israel and Gaza, because children are children. There is once again a civil war in Sudan that is leaving millions homeless and starving. Our children will inherit an environmental crisis that may still be avoidable. Whatever issues or crisis call to you, I urge you to learn from Bishop Woods and from Linda Blackman and from Elie Wiesel. Take sides and take action. Action driven by love and driven by the prayers for peace and justice for everyone.
In reflecting on our trip experiences, I'm really still unable to encapsulate in succinct words the visceral emotional experiences and knowledge gained from this trip. So, in order to avoid triggering similar visceral reactions to the American tales of human rights abuses, I've created some questions and a brief observation as a result of this experience. Who knew that the tools and knowledge that became the foundation of modern gynecologic practice were gained from a surgeon performing pelvic exams and surgical procedures without anesthesia on young enslaved women no longer able to work after having had serious labor and delivery complications that resulted in permanent anatomical abnormalities? Did you know that the second largest union strike in the US occurred in 1888 in Louisiana? But it was only in 2012 that the descendants of those individuals received the acknowledgement from the community that both the leaders and the citizens in the town of the strike had ended the strike with lynchings using guns. Who knew that many individuals who were victims of lynchings are in unmarked graves and are still not known by name, and that museum that is formed in Alabama is to have some place to acknowledge that they existed and what they experienced? Did you know that a lynching occurred in Cleveland a little over a century ago? Who knew that 1/3 of Black men in the US have already or will spend part of their adult life in prison? Did you know that currently some state penitentiaries, which were built on plantation farm property, have contemporary prisoners who still use the same tools that their slave ancestors used, performing agricultural work and minimally paid? Can you imagine what it feels like if your son was imprisoned in such a state penitentiary, possibly for a crime not committed or a more severe punishment than would occur for others committing the crime in other states? My question, as I observed the remarkable individuals that we listened to in Atlanta, Selma, and Birmingham, was what was the source of the wells of strength and resilience that these elders had? It was interesting in the beginning to experience their service and look at what their hymns verses were based on. Many of them were based on Psalms or other aspects from our Tanakh. And they all had a remarkable focus with hope, looking at their children, grandchildren, and hope for the future. So here on Martin Luther King Shabbat, I hope more of my head is out of the sand in order to recognize ways to reveal and or repair past and present wrongs and support our fellow American minority citizens as they seek equal justice and better their lives and their families' lives.
It's kind of tough to go last. I'll keep the remarks brief because you've already heard from several of us, and I don't want to keep you from Kiddush. However, Debbie and I were privileged to participate in this trip. It really was a privilege. Words fail to describe how meaningful the trip was, but I'll do my best. If there's ever another trip like this one, I urge you to join it. I'll start with a basic Jewish concept. The entire human family is created in the image of God. So everyone, regardless of race, ethnic origin, etc., deserves consideration and respect from each of us. But what happens when one group of people, through bigotry against another group of people, creates an irrational us versus them? We know this story as our own, the Shoah being one example. But what about when it's a different group of people? This trip helped us focus on the horrible consequences of bigotry against African Americans. Others have focused on our shared experience. I'll give one example of that, but then I'll share an experience unique to Debbie and me. Among the many moving and informative experiences on the trip, one stands out: our visit to the lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. The memorial consists of steel pillars suspended from a roof. The pillars get progressively higher as one moves through them, forcing one to look up to see them. As our guide said, we are forced to offer our necks, looking up to see, inscribed on each of the pillars, the names of lynching victims who were mostly hung by the neck from trees. Each pillar represents a different incident of lynching. They are sadly many, many pillars. Lynchings can be defined as mob violence. In all of these cases, a mob of white people directed against an individual or group of individuals, in almost all of these cases African Americans, to terrorize them and keep them in their place, almost always with the authorities complicit or looking the other way. Hung from trees by angry mobs with no trial and no opportunity to defend themselves, the black victims of white lynchings were not only denied their basic rights, but were made examples of to terrorize black people from thinking they had the same rights as white people, and perhaps just as importantly, to convince white people that these black people were somehow less than them and that the lynchings were in some sense a kind of sport to which some people brought their children to cheer on the angry mob. What were some of the reasons for lynchings? Often a black man was accused of sexually assaulting a white woman, but lynched on innuendo with no evidence at all and certainly no due process of law. Frequently, lynchings occurred with no more provocation than a black man being accused of merely looking directly at a white woman rather than averting his eyes, or saying something to a white person that was perceived as disrespectful. Our guide encouraged us to use our phones to look up the names of the lynching victims on a particular pillar to help flesh out the story. I picked one that occurred in Texas. I was curious. On one day, 2 people were lynched, no reason given. On the next day, 15 more were lynched. Why 2 on one day and 15 more the next? What was the reason? Perhaps not surprisingly, there was very little information online from the contemporaneous newspaper reports of that particular lynching. No names were listed, but the article implied that a righteous white mob had taken action against 2 uppity well, you know the word. Apparently, some 15 more black people had the temerity to be outside in public the next day, and the still angry white mob punished them for that sin. Of the more than 4,000 documented lynchings, most occurred in the South. But, as Terry observed, one occurred in Cuyahoga County. On June 27, 1911, a black man named Jordan was accused of stealing cherries from a white farmer on the west side. Word got around fast. A white mob formed, hunted Jordan down, and shot and killed him before the police could intervene. Jordan's life was taken not so much because of his petty theft, but really because he was a black man stealing from a white farmer. Now on to the experience unique to Debbie and me. We separated from the group at the end of our tour to fly directly to Cleveland from Birmingham, Alabama. As we were driving away after our group had lunch together, we let our Uber driver know why we had visited Birmingham. We told him that we had visited the park where Birmingham's White Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, presided over police fire hosing and sicking attack dogs on African-American teenagers and even younger children who were protesting on May 2nd and 3rd, 1963, against segregation. Over 1,000 kids participated in the protest march. They were recruited, as has been observed, because adults would often lose their jobs by participating in similar protests, but children did not bear that risk. When Birmingham's jails became full on the first day of the protest, Bull Connor had the bright idea of using doubled-up fire hoses as water cannons, along with attack dogs, to try to disperse and harm the black children who had the temerity to protest that black people had the same rights as white people and should not have to tolerate segregation. He would show them their place. Separate inferior institutions, poorer schools, hot movie theater balconies, separate shops, lunch counters, water fountains. You know the story. Moving to the back of the bus to make way for an inherently superior white rider. Our Uber driver told us that a friend of his was one of the teenagers attacked by Bull Connor's police on May 3rd, 1963. We had already learned that the fire hoses turned on the kids had such intense water pressure that the water not only knocked them down, but frequently caused severe injury. We knew the same was true for the attack dogs, but we hadn't had a specific example until our Uber driver gave us one. Our driver told us his friend was attacked by a large dog, which tried to bite him in his arm and his neck. The child, fearful for his life and perhaps driven by adrenaline from that fear, whipped off his jacket, managed to wrap it around the dog's head, and used the only weapon he had, a small pocket knife, to try to drive the dog off and cause it to retreat. Of the more than 1,000 kids participating in the protest march, over 600 were jailed and countless were injured by the water cannons and attack dogs. In the aftermath, an agreement was reached to desegregate lunch counters, fitting rooms, restrooms, and drinking fountains. But this was not the end of the story. Disgruntled segregationists, many affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan, responded by detonating a bomb in the 16th Street Baptist Church, as you've already heard, killing 4 young black girls. And this was one of only some 50 bombings of black churches and homes, giving Birmingham the nickname Bombingham. Some 40 of these bombings were never solved. No perpetrators were apprehended. No one was brought to justice. There are many other tragic stories like this, and you can hear about them if you just ask us. And I encourage you to ask us, because I could talk for an hour and still not tell all the stories of the things we learned on this trip. This is a wonderful country with wonderful opportunities. But when those opportunities are systematically denied to one group of people by another group of people through racial bigotry, we see tragic results. Much progress has been made, ironically allowing states that were proud centers of segregation to now be centers of civil rights tourism, of which we were part. Today's Parashah Shmot begins the story of our own liberation from slavery. On this Martin Luther King Day, We may still not agree on what needs to be done beyond the elimination of slavery to realize Dr. King's dream of people not being judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Nevertheless, this trip begins a conversation for many of us, a conversation we should have already been having. We learn that the promise of America is dimmer when we tolerate bigotry and brighter when we eliminate segregation and punish or disincentivize bigotry. Anyway, I hope I've given you another little taste of what this trip was like and what it was about. There's much more that I could share. There's much more that all of us could share. Please ask us, and please do, if you have an opportunity, take a trip like this yourself. It really will change your life.
Another big thank you to Allison, to Greg, to Terry, to David, to Brad, all those who shared their experiences, to all the participants who came. Want to invite everybody on Monday at 10 a.m. at Olivet. We're having an MLK event program with our GCC partners. Just want to end with one thought. There's a Kabbalistic corollary to Newton's law of gravity, that what goes up must come down, and it's called Yerida Letzorach Aliyah, what goes down must come up. This was very difficult. This was hard for many of us to hear, but there's a Jewish principle that what goes down must come up. Just as we went down to Egypt as slaves, what was next? We rose up to the mountain. I've been to the mountain, was MLK's final speech, to receive Torah. So I want to strengthen, encourage, and embolden all of us on our path from degradation to freedom, redemption, and Torah. Thank you all, and we're going to conclude with Adon Olam. Please rise. Symbolically, not because you have to. Page 211, Adon Olam.
In honor of Martin Luther King Jr. this weekend and all those who fought for civil rights, please join me in the melody for We Shall Overcome to Adon Olam. Adon Olam asher malach v'terem kol yitzir nivra le'ein na'asa v'chefzo kol azai melech shmo nikra ve'acharei kichlot hakol levado yimloch nora ve'hu haya ve'hu hove ve'hu yihya betifara ve'hu echad ve'ein sheini lehamshil lo leachbira beli reishit beli tachlit velo ha'oz ve'hamisra ve'hu eli ve'chai go'ali v'tzor chavli be'etzara ve'hu nisi umanos li v'nat kosi be'yom ekra Be'yado afkid ruchi ve'etishan ve'a'ira ve'im ruchi geviati Adonai li ve'lo ira